It was supposed to be another polished royal appearance, another carefully managed moment wrapped in smiles, tradition, and controlled symbolism. But then Prince William said the words no one expected, and once they landed, the atmosphere changed instantly. What sounded like praise to the public felt, inside palace walls, like a direct transfer of power. In one sentence, Catherine was elevated, Camilla was diminished, and the monarchy's hidden battle lines were suddenly impossible to ignore. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Everything about the occasion had been designed to project calm. The royal family stood inside that familiar world of composure and ritual, where every smile carried purpose and every gesture had already been weighed for meaning. To the public, it looked seamless, almost comforting, the kind of appearance meant to reassure a nation that the monarchy still knew how to perform unity, even when pressure gathered beneath the surface. But that illusion only made what came next more devastating. When William spoke, the balance shifted so quickly it was almost impossible to process in real time. He did not merely praise Catherine as a loyal partner or a beloved figure by his side. He placed her somewhere higher, somewhere more powerful, somewhere that made the old order tremble. "She is our future" did not sound like affection. It sounded like a declaration. That was the moment the atmosphere changed. Not publicly at first, not in any way that could be officially acknowledged, but in the subtle, dangerous language of royal survival. Tight expressions appeared where warmth had been expected. Smiles remained, but they no longer looked effortless. Around them, the machinery of court awareness seemed to click into motion all at once, because those 4 words were not small, and they were not innocent. In a family built on rank, legacy, and invisible lines of control, William had just done something extraordinary. He had spoken as though Catherine were no longer simply part of the future, but the future itself. That difference was everything. To ordinary listeners, it felt romantic, even noble. A prince publicly honoring the woman who had stood beside him through scrutiny, pressure, and expectation. But inside royal circles, words are never received at face value. They are measured for implication, for threat, for hierarchy. And what William's statement implied was impossible to dismiss. Catherine was no longer being framed as support. She was being framed as supremacy. She was no longer the graceful figure beside the heir. She was becoming the emotional and symbolic center of what came next. And if Catherine was the future, then what did that make Camilla in the present? That was where the real sting lived. William had not attacked Camilla directly. He had done something far more sophisticated and, in palace terms, far more brutal. He had spoken a truth so large and so publicly that it reduced everyone around Catherine without ever naming them. Camilla's position was not erased in law or title, but it was undeniably diminished in spirit. The emotional weight of the monarchy seemed to shift away from her and toward Catherine in a single stroke, and those listening closely would have understood exactly how dangerous that was. Because once the public begins to feel that one woman represents destiny and another represents delay, the monarchy's internal balance starts to break in ways no statement can easily repair. And that is why the deeper question lingered long after the applause and formalities moved on. Was this simply a husband overcome by admiration, speaking from pride and conviction in an unguarded moment, or had William chosen this stage, this language, and this timing with chilling precision, knowing exactly what message it would send to the palace, to the public, and to the women whose roles were now colliding in full view of the world? Because in royal history, words are never just words, and once William placed Catherine above everyone else in the public imagination, the tension turned to the one woman who stood to lose the most. For years, Camilla's rise had been one of the monarchy's most carefully managed transformations. She had weathered scandal, survived public hostility, and fought for legitimacy in a system that rarely forgives. But just when her place seemed finally secured, Catherine's glow began eclipsing everything around her. And when William's declaration landed, it didn't just overshadow Camilla, it threatened to rewrite the balance of female power at the heart of the crown. Camilla had never been handed easy acceptance, and that is what made this moment so dangerous. Her position had not been built on innocence, romance, or public fantasy. It had been built the hard way through endurance, discipline, and an almost ruthless understanding of how royal institutions actually survive. She had absorbed years of resentment, years of cold judgment, years of being measured against a past she could never fully escape. Yet she stayed. She adapted. She learned the unspoken rules of palace life better than many born into it. In time, she stopped being merely tolerated and began to look, at least from the outside, secure. But royal security is rarely real. It is conditional, fragile, and always tied to perception. The moment perception changes, power begins to slip. That was the cruelty of William's statement. It did not strip Camilla of title, but it struck at something even more delicate relevance. Her authority had always depended on careful balance, her closeness to the king, her command of protocol, her symbolic place within the current structure. She represented the present order, the hard-won arrangement that allowed the monarchy to keep moving without reopening old wounds too publicly. But Catherine represented something else entirely, something far more difficult to manage. She was not simply admired. She was believed in, and belief is far more dangerous than approval, because approval can be negotiated, while belief takes on a life of its own. Catherine's power was not loud, and that only made it stronger. She moved through royal life with a kind of effortless certainty that made everyone around her seem as though they were either preparing the way or standing in it. Her popularity did not feel temporary. It did not feel fashionable. It felt generational, as though the public had already decided that the monarchy's emotional future belonged to her, whether the institution was ready or not. Camilla, politically sharp enough to understand shifts before others dared name them, would have recognized the threat immediately. This was not just another flattering moment for the Princess of Wales. This was the public elevation of a rival center of gravity. And that is what made the humiliation so sharp. To still occupy one of the highest positions in the realm, and yet feel the emotional spotlight move elsewhere, that is the kind of royal wound no ceremony can heal. Because the monarchy survives on symbols as much as titles, and William had just tilted the symbolic order in Catherine's favour. He had not attacked Camilla. He had done something more irreversible. He had made her seem like the figure of a fading chapter, while Catherine was cast as the living promise of the next one. For a woman who had fought so long to solidify her place, that kind of sidelining would not feel abstract. It would feel personal, intimate, almost unbearable. So the question inside palace walls was no longer whether Camilla understood what had happened. Of course she did. The real question was what she would do with that understanding. Would she maintain her silence expected of her, preserving dignity while the ground shifted beneath her feet? Would she allow the public to drift further toward Catherine without resistance? Or would she begin, in the quiet and careful way power often defends itself, to push back from behind the curtain before the future hardened into something permanent? And if Camilla felt the shift instantly, the palace machine felt it too, because behind every royal sentence lies an army of advisors already calculating who gains, who falls, and who must be contained. The public heard a heartfelt tribute. The palace heard a breach. Behind closed doors, where every sentence is passed like statecraft, and every gesture is dissected for hidden intent, William's words detonated like a controlled explosion. Gone rogue. Phones lit up, advisors scrambled, loyalists picked sides, and in rooms the public never sees, one terrifying question began to circulate. Had the future king just openly redrawn the monarchy's internal hierarchy? The response did not begin with shouting. In royal life, panic rarely announces itself so plainly. It arrives polished, measured, and wrapped in the language of context, clarification, and continuity. That was how the palace machine moved in the aftermath of William's declaration. Communications teams did what they are trained to do when danger appears in the shape of a headline. They moved quickly, but never in a way that would admit the existence of a problem. No one could be seen correcting William, because that would validate the idea that something had gone wrong, and yet no one could ignore what he had done, because the phrase had already escaped into public imagination, where it was being repeated, celebrated, and interpreted with growing certainty. The palace was trying to contain a fire while pretending the room was not getting hotter. Inside that effort, the divisions began almost immediately. Some insisted William had simply spoken from the heart, that this was nothing more than a devoted husband publicly honoring the woman he believed in most. Others were far less willing to dismiss it as emotion. They heard calculation in the timing, precision in the wording, and power in the placement. To them, this was not a tribute. It was strategic positioning, a deliberate act designed to elevate Catherine beyond affection and into inevitability. And for the most anxious voices in the room, it sounded like something even sharper than that, a warning shot fired from the future, aimed directly at the old internal order. That fear came from what the public was now being invited to feel. Catherine was no longer being presented as beloved support to the heir. She was beginning to look more central than Camilla in the emotional architecture of the crown, perhaps even more central than palace tradition would normally allow. That possibility unsettled senior courtiers because royal institutions survive through sequence, not acceleration. They depend on gradual transitions, carefully managed symbolism, and the slow conditioning of public perception. William had threatened all of that. In one sentence, he seemed to suggest that the monarchy did not have time for the usual pace anymore. He was not waiting for Catherine to become the future in the formal sense. He was placing her there now, in the minds of millions, before the institution had officially made room for it. That was when the deeper fracture sharpened. Traditionalists closed ranks around continuity, determined to protect the structure as it stood. To them, this was danger, rouse impatience, an emotional shortcut that could destabilize the careful dignity of succession. But the modernists saw something else. They saw Catherine as the answer to the monarchy's growing crisis of relevance, the figure capable of carrying it into a harsher, faster, less forgiving age. To them, William had not committed an error. He had simply said aloud what the public already sensed and what the palace had been too cautious to admit. From there, every private conversation became heavier. Who had approved that phrasing? Who had failed to soften it? Who wanted this shift, and who had been caught off guard by it? Suspicion spread beneath the official composure. The monarchy, so terrified of appearing divided, was beginning to reveal the outlines of its fracture simply through the strain of hiding it. And hovering over everything was a question too volatile to confront directly. Was William only lifting Catherine higher, or was he quietly helping bury an older model of royal womanhood beneath the rise of a new one? But this was never just a communications crisis, because beneath the headlines and palace spin was something even more dangerous. William's declaration revealed how deeply personal this struggle had already become. To the public, William and Catherine had long embodied the ideal royal partnership: steady, graceful, disciplined, reassuring. But what if that image was only the surface of something far more consequential? What if, beneath the choreography of devotion, there had been a years-long project underway, not simply preserving the monarchy, but reshaping it around Catherine herself? Because after William's declaration, their marriage no longer looked symbolic. It looked sovereign. That is what made the moment feel so much larger than a husband praising his wife. For years, William and Catherine had been presented as the calm face of continuity, the dependable pair who could steady the institution simply by appearing unshaken within it. They were easy to admire because they seemed to offer exactly what royal life always craves in moments of uncertainty: discipline without coldness, elegance without chaos, warmth without recklessness. But after William publicly named Catherine as the future, that familiar image became impossible to read in the same innocent way. What once looked like a marriage built to support the crown now began to look like a partnership quietly preparing to redefine it. Their union no longer felt decorative. It felt like strategy fused with destiny. William's declaration carried the force of something deeper than protection. He was not shielding Catherine from criticism or simply celebrating her value in his life. He was placing her above the usual language of royal companionship. In doing so, he revealed a level of trust so complete it bordered on surrender. He was not saying that she would stand beside his reign. He was suggesting that she would shape it, perhaps even give it meaning in ways he alone could not. That is where the emotional charge became almost overwhelming, because for a future king to elevate his wife in that way is not only romantic, it is profoundly political. It tells the public that the woman beside him is not an accessory to power. She is part of power itself, and Catherine, in this emerging narrative, does not need to seize anything. That is the unsettling brilliance of her position. She does not appear hungry, loud, or visibly ambitious. She remains composed, restrained, and almost impossibly controlled, which only makes her ascent feel stronger. She is the kind of figure who never needs to demand authority because authority seems to gather around her naturally. She does not chase the center of gravity. She becomes it. That quiet effectiveness is precisely what makes her so formidable within a monarchy built on image, patience, and emotional symbolism. In an age when the public is restless, skeptical, and increasingly difficult to move, Catherine appears to do the impossible. She makes the institution feel understandable again. Not modern in a crude sense, not rebellious, but emotionally legible. That may be what William understands better than anyone else. He may see in Catherine the one figure capable of translating monarchy into something people still want to believe in, not through force, but through presence. Not through noise, but through steadiness. And that is how the framing around her begins to take on something almost mythic. She becomes more than admired. She becomes necessary, elegant, controlled, maternal, strategic, and increasingly inevitable. She begins to resemble not just the next queen, but the answer to the monarchy's fear of fading relevance. The more William places faith in her, the more the public reads that faith as evidence that she is the institution's true emotional anchor. Yet even here, one question lingers with almost dangerous intensity. Did Catherine know what William was about to do? Had they reached this moment through quiet alignment, through private understanding forged over years of pressure and preparation, or did she receive those words in real time, absorbing their weight as the rest of the palace did, realizing in that instant that her position had just changed forever? Either possibility carries its own charge. If it was planned, then their partnership is even more formidable than it appears. If it was spontaneous, then William's instinct to raise her above everyone else may be stronger and more revealing than any strategy advisor could have designed. Either way, something irreversible has happened. Their love story can no longer be separated from the power story unfolding around them. Tog. Ether, they are no longer simply waiting for history to hand them their roles. They are beginning, carefully but unmistakably, to claim those roles in advance. And that is precisely what made the declaration so explosive, because once Catherine stopped looking like the future queen beside William, and started looking like the monarchy's defining center of gravity, every other woman in the royal orbit was forced into comparison. Royal history is often told through kings, heirs, and lines of succession, but inside palaces, dynasties are just as often shaped by women, by image, by endurance, by emotional control, by who commands loyalty without ever raising their voice. And now, in the most dangerous comparison of all, Catherine and Camilla stood as two competing visions of royal womanhood, one forged through survival, the other glowing with destiny. That contrast had existed for some time, but it had once remained subtle enough to manage. The monarchy could keep both women in view without forcing the public to choose between them. Camilla held the authority of the present, the weight of experience, the realism of someone who had already endured the worst and learned how to survive it. Catherine carried the promise of what came next, the softer but more powerful pull of renewal, grace, and emotional connection. For a while, the institution benefited from that balance. One woman represented endurance through fire, the other represented hope without visible scars. But William's declaration shattered the careful distance between those roles. The quiet contrast became something harsher, more exposed, and far more dangerous. An open hierarchy the entire world could now feel. Camilla stood for a harder version of monarchy, one built not on fantasy, but on adaptation. She knew what it meant to be resisted, resented, scrutinized, and still refused to disappear. Her strength was naive, going to look glamorous in the way public adoration tends to reward. It was made of patience, compromise, calculation, and the kind of emotional armor only years of survival can forge. She represented the institution at its most realistic, wounded, disciplined, pragmatic, and capable of carrying on even when love was uncertain. There was power in that, real power, but it was the kind of power that can only hold as long as the system keeps honoring endurance over enchantment. Catherine, by contrast, seemed to embody everything the monarchy most desperately wanted the future to feel like. She was not simply admired for composure or beauty. She radiated legitimacy in a more instinctive way, as though the public had placed its emotional trust in her long before protocol could fully explain why. She symbolized order without fatigue, elegance without visible bitterness, discipline without hardness. Where Camilla appeared to have fought for her place, Catherine seemed to arrive at hers, almost as if history had been waiting for her. To supporters, that made her rise feel natural, even necessary. To those who believed in the sanctity of sequence and rank, it felt destabilizing. Because if Catherine's ascent was being powered by emotional inevitability rather than formal progression, then the old rules were already beginning to weaken. That is what made the rivalry so merciless. It did not need to be announced to become real. The palace could deny tension, avoid direct conflict, and preserve the rituals of composure, but none of that could stop the comparison from happening. Every appearance now carried undertones. Every silence suggested calculation. Every carefully neutral expression became the subject of whispered interpretation. That is the cruelty of royal life at this level. The battle does not need to be fought openly for it to leave bruises. Sometimes the deepest wound, psalms, come from simply being measured and found less essential than the person standing beside you. For Camilla, that pain would cut deeper than politics. This was not only about titles or ceremonial precedence. It was about relevance, and in royal life relevance is as vital as rank. To feel the emotional center of the monarchy shifting away, while still wearing the weight of office, is to experience a kind of erasure no official statement can ever soften. Catherine's rise did not merely brighten her own standing, it cast a harsher light on everyone else. And because William had now publicly placed emotional supremacy in Catherine's hands, Camilla was no longer being compared as one powerful woman among several. She was being compared to the woman the future itself seemed to be choosing. That is why the atmosphere around them had become so charged. This was no longer just a matter of personal style or generational difference. It was a confrontation between two female archetypes inside the same institution, each carrying a different answer to what the monarchy should become. Yet while the women at the center of the monarchy were being silently measured against one another, another force was magnifying the conflict beyond palace walls, and that force was the public itself. Palaces can negotiate protocol, courtiers can shape narratives, but the one thing the monarchy has never fully controlled is raw public emotion. And after William's declaration, that emotion surged in one unmistakable direction. Crowds cheered louder, headlines sharpened. Social conversation erupted. Catherine was no longer just admired, she was being claimed. Not as a future queen in waiting, but as the woman people believed should already define the crown. That was the moment everything moved beyond palace choreography and entered the far more dangerous territory of public feeling. Institutions can manage schedules, symbolism, and carefully worded statements, but they cannot easily contain a wave of emotional certainty once it begins to rise. William's words did not merely land well. They unlocked something that had been building for years beneath the surface. For many people, this was not a surprise revelation at all. It felt like confirmation. Catherine, in their eyes, had already become the monarchy's emotional center long before anyone dared phrase it so openly. William had simply spoken the sentence that made millions feel seen in what they already believed, and once that happened, admiration turned into something stronger, more active, more difficult to reverse. The response was immediate because it came from instinct. People did not react as though they had been given a royal update. They reacted as though a truth had finally been spoken aloud. That is what made the atmosphere so electrifying. Catherine was no longer being discussed merely as an admired figure who would one day step into greater responsibility. She was being embraced as the answer to a deeper hunger for steadiness, for grace, for renewal, for a monarchy that still felt emotionally alive. The language around her began to shift. She was no longer simply respected. She was desired by the public in a symbolic sense, almost summoned into greater prominence by collective will. In that shift lay a power the palace could neither officially endorse nor easily suppress. And then came the amplification. One sentence became 1,000 interpretations. Commentators dissected it, supporters repeated it, and the wider cultural conversation began moving with a force that no press office could fully redirect. The more people talked, the larger Catherine became. The more her image circulated through admiration, fascination, and emotional projection, the less she seemed like a figure contained by rank alone. That, says when public love stopped looking harmless. Because love, when concentrated around a royal figure, can become something close to a parallel mandate. It creates its own hierarchy, one built not on constitutional order, but on emotional allegiance. And once that kind of power forms, it begins pressuring the institution from the outside. That pressure fell hardest on Camilla. Officially, she still occupied one of the highest and most central positions within the monarchy, but emotionally, the ground beneath her was changing fast. The public was no longer simply celebrating Catherine's qualities in isolation. It was measuring everyone else against her radiance, and that comparison was ruthless. Camilla remained central in title, but increasingly peripheral in feeling. That is the cruelty of public momentum. It does not always announce whom it is pushing aside, but it pushes all the same. Catherine's rise was becoming more than affection. It was beginning to resemble a popular mandate, a collective insistence that she should already represent the monarchy's truest face. William may have meant only to honor her, but in doing so he unleashed something far larger than tribute. He accelerated a public movement that no longer seemed willing to wait for formal timing. The emotional order had begun to outrun the ceremonial one, and with that came a classic royal danger. When the people decide who their symbolic sovereign is before the institution has finished arranging the sequence. At that point, enthusiasm itself becomes a weapon, even if no one intends it to be. Anyone perceived as delaying Catherine's ascendancy risks looking not dutiful, but obstructive. Anyone who hesitates risks appearing out of touch with the future, rushing toward them. That is why the palace could not afford to misunderstand what was happening. This was no passing wave of excitement. It was a realignment of public emotion, and those are often the moments that alter royal history far more deeply than official decrees. And once the public had chosen, silence inside the palace became more dangerous than noise because every non-response began to look like resistance. And every delay started to feel like a brewing confrontation. In royal crises, what is said matters, but what is not said can be even more devastating. After William's declaration, one absence began to loom over everything. No immediate correction, no visible rebalancing, no definitive reaffirmation of Camilla's standing. And in that silence, speculation metastasized. Was the king holding back? Was the palace divided? Or had the monarchy's inner circle already realized that what William started in public could not be undone in private? Silence in a monarchy is never empty. It is rarely accidental and almost never harmless. When no response came to steady the narrative, the void itself became a message, or at least it was treated like one. In ordinary institutions, a pause can buy time. In royal life, a pause invites interpretation. Every hour without clarification deepened the sense that something larger was unfolding behind closed doors, something too sensitive to confront directly and too dangerous to dismiss. The public began reading restraint as discomfort. Insiders began reading it as strategy, or worse, as paralysis. And once those two readings started feeding each other, the silence stopped looking dignified. It started looking loaded. At the center of that unease stood the king, not because he had spoken, but because he had not. That absence created a pressure point no one could ignore. Was he remaining quiet because he understood the sensitivity of the moment and wished to avoid inflaming it further? Was this the practiced ambiguity of a sovereign who knew that every intervention can create a second crisis while solving the first? Or was something more human and more unsettling taking hold beneath the surface? Fatigue, emotional conflict, even hesitation in the face of a struggle he could no longer fully contain. The longer the silence endured, the more it began to suggest not only discipline, but vulnerability. And vulnerability at the top of a royal structure has a way of making everyone beneath it more nervous. Inside palace walls, that nervousness hardened into agitation. When official restraint leaves too much room, rumor rushes in to occupy it. People close to the institution began circling the same questions with growing intensity. Camilla's allies would have seen the danger immediately. From their perspective, silence was not neutral, it was exposure. If Catherine's rise had just been supercharged in public, and no equivalent gesture followed to reinforce Camilla's standing, then the emotional imbalance would only worsen. They would have wanted symbolism, language, something unmistakable to remind the world that rank still mattered, that the present had not already surrendered to the future. Without that reassurance, Camilla risked looking not simply overshadowed, but abandoned by the very structure that had once fought to secure her place. But William's supporters could read the same silence in exactly the opposite way. To them, the lack of correction may have looked like tacit acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that what had been said could not be unsaid, because, at some level, it reflected a truth too large to challenge openly. If Catherine had already become the emotional future of the monarchy, then perhaps the palace understood that resisting that tide would only make the institution appear frightened of its own next chapter, and so the silence itself became a battlefield. One side saw dangerous neglect, the other saw silent recognition. Both interpretations deepened the fracture. That is when the crisis stopped being about messaging alone. This was no longer merely a matter of smoothing over headlines or controlling the tone of public discussion. The deeper issue now touched loyalty, succession psychology, and the unbearable strain of family politics wrapped inside state symbolism. The monarchy seemed trapped between present legitimacy and future necessity. Camilla remained the embodiment of the established order, the current queenly authority whose place had been painfully secured. Catherine, meanwhile, was becoming something harder to define, but more powerful to feel the royal future people were already emotionally investing in. If both narratives continued at once, the institution risked splitting itself in public view, one woman carrying official status, the other carrying the emotional crown, and that possibility was what made the atmosphere so claustrophobic. Because once a royal family starts being read as emotionally divided, the danger is no longer limited to public perception. It seeps inward, it alters conversations, loyalties, reactions, and the meaning of every carefully controlled appearance. Preservation and transformation stop being abstract ideas and start looking like opposing instincts inside the same bloodline. The palace may still have tried to maintain a united front, but by now, unity was becoming harder to perform without fully believing it, because once the palace could no longer convincingly project unity, the crisis shifted into its most combustible phase of all the moment when private wounds and public symbolism began feeding each other. There are moments in royal history when a figure stops inhabiting a title and starts transcending it, when presence becomes influence and influence becomes inevitability. After William's declaration, Catherine seemed to enter exactly that territory. Her eye gesture appeared more deliberate. Every appearance carried more weight. She was no longer being watched simply as a princess preparing for the future. She was being read as something larger, the monarchy's answer to its own survival. From that point on, Catherine no longer seemed to move through royal life in the ordinary sense. She seemed to rise above it without ever appearing to try. That was the strange power of the transformation. Nothing about her needed to become louder to feel bigger. In fact, the opposite was true. The less she said, the more people projected meaning onto her restraint. The more composed she remained, the more her poise began to feel like command. This is the monarchy's oldest and most difficult language, the art of saying little while allowing the world to feel everything, and Catherine appeared to be mastering it at exactly the moment the institution seemed most desperate for. Someone who could carry its emotional burden without visible strain. That is why William's declaration no longer looked like a single dramatic outburst once the days moved forward. It began to feel like an unveiling. A sentence that first sounded shocking started to resemble a threshold, the public revelation of a reality that had already been forming beneath the surface. Catherine's presence after that moment was charged in a way that could not easily be explained by routine admiration. She seemed touched by symbolic intensity, as if the words spoken about her had changed not just how people saw her, but what she represented. She was no longer standing in the shadow of what one day might come. She was beginning to embody the thing itself: continuity, renewal, control, and hope, fused into one figure who now appeared almost too significant to be contained by her formal role. To the public, That restraint read as strength. It suggested discipline, certainty, and the kind of confidence that never needs to announce itself. To the palace, however, the same quality could look like something more strategic, not necessarily scheming, not crudely ambitious, but consolidating. Catherine did not need to fight for space, because space seemed to open around her on its own. That is what made her ascent so unsettling to those still trying to preserve the older balance. She was not disrupting the monarchy with rebellion, she was overtaking it through indispensability. She made humility look powerful, and that is far more difficult to resist than open ambition. Open ambition can be criticized, quiet indispensability becomes sacred, and while Catherine's symbolic presence grew, the shrinking space around Camilla became harder to ignore. The contrast was now painfully visible. Catherine's relevance expanded with every passing moment, while Camilla's narrative room seemed to narrow without anyone having to say so directly. The cruelty of that shift lay in how silent it was, no formal demotion, no open confrontation, just the slow and devastating transfer of emotional significance from one woman to another. Camilla still stood within the architecture of power, but Catherine was increasingly becoming the story people cared about most. In royal life, that difference can mean everything. Titles govern protocol. Emotional centrality governs memory. That is where Catherine's rise began to take on something almost mythic. She started to feel less like a single royal figure and more like a historic answer emerging at a moment of institutional vulnerability. Not because law had changed, but because feeling had. Not because the Constitution had spoken, but because millions had. The crown has always depended not only on structure, but on belief. And Catherine, in this new atmosphere, seemed to command belief in a way that few royal figures ever do. She was becoming a force defined less by official position than by emotional legitimacy. And that kind of legitimacy can reshape a monarchy more profoundly than ceremonial rank ever could. So the question hanging over everything became impossible to avoid. Was Catherine still rising within the role prepared for her, or had she already moved beyond it? Had she become so central, so emotionally necessary, that the institution itself was now being reimagined around her, rather than merely awaiting her formal arrival? That possibility felt thrilling to some, alarming to others, and unbearable to those watching their own relevance fade in the process. And if that question terrified some inside the palace, it thrilled millions outside it, because what began as one sentence from William now felt like the opening act of a royal transformation no one could stop. In the end, this was never just about a speech. It was about a line being crossed in full view of the world. With one declaration, Prince William did more than praise Catherine. He positioned her above rivalry, above hesitation, above the old balance that had kept the women of the monarchy carefully separated by role and rank. And now the question echoing through the palace is no longer whether Catherine is the future. It is whether the future has already begun without permission. That is the real revelation at the heart of everything that followed. William did not simply offer Catherine admiration in a public moment charged with emotion. He did something much more consequential. He identified her in front of the world as the monarchy's supreme emotional and symbolic future. That distinction matters because royal power has never existed through titles alone. It lives in belief, in instinct, in the feeling people attach to one figure over another. And by speaking as he did, William shifted that feeling with unmistakable force. He made Catherine appear not as one important woman within the royal structure, but as the woman around whom the next era would be built. Once that happened, the old balance could not hold. Camilla's sidelining, then, was not some accidental misunderstanding or unfortunate side effect of a loving tribute. It was the unavoidable consequence of what William set in motion. The moment Catherine was raised that high in the public imagination, everyone else around her became smaller by comparison, especially the woman whose standing depended on preserving the current order. Camilla remained protected by title, by structure, by official place, but emotionally the tide had turned. And once emotional authority begins shifting away from the present and toward the future, it becomes painfully hard for any institution to reverse it without looking frightened of its own destiny. That is the dangerous ground the royal family now finds itself forced to navigate. On one side stands formal hierarchy, the carefully maintained system of rank, timing, and ceremonial logic that has long held the monarchy together. On the other stands popular legitimacy, something less controllable, but often far more powerful once it takes root. Catherine now sits at the center of that conflict. She has emerged not merely as a future queen by succession, but as a chosen vessel of continuity, renewal, and public trust. That is why her rise feels so charged. She does not only represent what comes next, she represents what many people believe the monarchy must become if it hopes to survive the emotional demands of a new age. And William's role in that transformation cannot be reduced to romance alone. What he did was deeply personal, yes, because it revealed his devotion, his confidence in Catherine, and his willingness to elevate her with full conviction before the world. But it was also deeply political. It carried the force of strategy, of impatience, even of generational revolt. Whether consciously or not, William challenged the slower, more cautious royal instinct that prefers transitions to happen quietly and in sequence. He acted as though the emotional future of the monarchy mattered more than preserving every layer of current comfort. That is what made his declaration feel so seismic. He was not only honoring his wife, he was accelerating history. The palace may still defend protocol. It may still cling to the language of order, continuity, and proper sequence. But emotionally, the public has already moved. That is the truth hanging over every silence, every appearance, every effort to restore balance. Catherine has become larger than the role the institution once seemed prepared to assign her. She now represents something closer to inevitability, and inevitability is one of the few forces even royal systems struggle to contain. This leaves the monarchy poised on a fault line that cannot remain hidden forever, preserve the current structure at all costs, or surrender to the rising force of Catherine's supremacy, and admit that the center has already shifted. And that is why this story ends, not with resolution, but with a deeper and more haunting tension. Because William did not merely defend his wife in a moment of public feeling. He may have done something far more historic. He may have anointed the woman who will eclipse everyone before her, not through formal rebellion, but through sheer emotional ascendancy. And if the crown's next chapter truly belongs to Catherine, then William's declaration will not be remembered as a headline. It will be remembered as the moment the monarchy quietly chose its new center. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.